Arushi, shall I start?
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you. Hello, our viewers on Facebook and here on Zoom. I welcome you all to another lecture series conducted by the Department of History, University of Delhi. And I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker. Today's our speaker is Dr. Mehr Afshan Farooqi, who grew up in Allahabad, India, a multiple gold medalist from Allahabad University. Farooqi is currently Associate Professor of Urdu and South Asian Literature at University of Virginia. Her research publications address complex issues of Urdu literary culture, particularly in the context of modernity. She is interested in bilingualism and how it impacts creativity. She is a well-known translator, anthologist, and columnist. She is editor of the pioneering two-volume work, the Oxford India Anthology of Modern Urdu Literature, published by Oxford University Press in 2008. More recently, she has published the acclaimed monograph, The Post-Colonial Mind, Urdu Culture, Islam, and Modernity in Muhammad Hassan Askari, published by Oxford University Press 2013. Farooqi also writes a featured column on Urdu literature of the past and present in the Dawn. Today, she'll speak on her new book, Ghalib, A Wilderness at the Doorstep, a critical biography. I welcome Professor Farooqi on behalf of the department, and we look forward to hear your lecture, ma'am. Before that, I want to also add up that Professor Amar Farooqi sir will be chairing this lecture. If sir I don't know whether the sir has joined. So, but it's over to you, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Shakir, for this generous introduction. And a good morning to all of you there in New Delhi, which is evening there, but it's morning for us here. I want to begin by thanking Dr. Afshan for giving me this opportunity to speak to come back to the history department, which is my first and most favorite home, because I started as a PhD student in history in the University of Allahabad. And then I went on to, work at the crossroads of history and literature. Mostly, I like to think of myself as a historian of literature. So today, what I want to do is I want to keep the talk more like a conversation and less like a talk. Because there are so many things that I want to talk about, I want to touch upon, that it would be difficult to, difficult to box Ghalib into one particular lecture. I mean, there's so many parts to his genius, and there are so many things into which he branches out into that it was difficult for me to come up with the title for this lecture to begin with. And I felt that I don't want to confine it to a particular topic. So having said that, let me sort of tell you a little bit about what are some of the points that I'm going to be talking about today. Well, the first point is what I call the linguistic paradox in Ghalib, and which is something that interests me a lot, about creativity in two languages, creativity in, we have what is called your native language or your mother tongue, and then you learn another language. Like for us, it's mostly English. But then if I were to be a poet in Urdu and English, what would it mean for me? Which language would I prefer? And which language would be the language that would bring me fame and recognition? So similarly for Ghalib, he wrote both in Farsi and Urdu. And interestingly, he wrote much, much more in Farsi than he did in Urdu. But it is in Urdu that he got everlasting fame. So this is one of the things that I'm going to be addressing today. The second thing I'm going to be talking about is the power of print. Because when I started my research on this book, on Ghalib in particular, as you know, there were many questions that I had to seek answers to. And one of the questions was, why did Ghalib edit the Urdu Diwan so severely. Now, many people don't even know that what we know as the Diwan-e-Ghalib is actually an intikhab. An intikhab is a selection. And this is what Ghalib did. He was he was known to be a difficult poet, and perhaps that was the reason why he did it. But I will go into this in greater detail in the course of my talk. So this is the second point that I will be focusing on, which is the power of print. The third thing that I want to talk about is Ghalib's self-presentation. What did Ghalib think of himself? What do poets actually think of themselves? Why do poets write? Why do people, what is the purpose of writing poetry? What is the end goal? I mean, uh, I might run into the risk of being, giving it a very socialist interpretation, but that's not the reason why I'm looking into this question. I'm looking at it purely from the point of view of readers, the reception history of Ghalib. Who were his readers? Who were the people who wanted to read Ghalib since he's known to be such a difficult poet? So that's the third and the last thing that I will be looking at. Let's now, I also have pictures and stuff that I would like to share. And occasionally I will share my screen when I'm given permission to share screen so that you can
Ma'am,
see.
you can share anytime. The permission is granted. So,
Okay, thank you so much. So every now and then I might want to share the screen just to sort of give you, give you a more visual presentation of Ghalib's activities and his way of, his especially his interactions with the world of print. Okay, so let me begin by giving you a very, very short thumbnail of Ghalib's career. Ghalib was born in 1897, sorry, in 1797. So the last few years of the 18th century. And in my book, actually, I put a question mark on this date because it seems not to agree with some of the other events in Ghalib's life. After a lot of research, I came to the conclusion that perhaps this date is just something that Ghalib came up with because when he started to publish his work and when he started interacting with the colonial readers, he felt that he needed to have a birth date and so on. So he came up with this particular birth date. But I feel that he was probably born a few years earlier than that. So we know that he got married at a very early age, at the age of 13, it is said. Um, and he started composing poetry at the age of 9 or 10. So he was a precocious genius. He was born in Agra. His father died when he was very young. He was 4 or 5 years old. And then his uncle became his guardian. His uncle also died. He fell from an elephant. Um, and so Ghalib was then brought up primarily at his grandparents' place in Agra. That means his mother's parents. So that some people think might have had some kind of impact on his personal psychology, but I'm not going to delve into that. I'm just giving you some of the important sort of bullets about his early life. After his marriage into this influential family, Ghalib moved to Delhi. It's not very clear again to have a date as to when he moved to Delhi. I think in the beginning he kept going back and forth between Agra and Delhi. And I feel that this is important because in spite of the fact that Agra was an important city and it had been the Mughal capital for many, many years, it was important to be in Delhi. It was important to be at the hub of the intellectual activities of the time. And so once Ghalib sort of moved back and forth, he eventually settled down in Delhi for good. Um, Now, we know that he started writing in Urdu. He began writing in Urdu at the age of 9 or 10. And by the time he was 19 years old, he had a divan. Now, a divan is a very specialized kind of collection of poems. For those of you who don't know, because we tend to think that the divan is just a collection of poems, but it is more than that. It is very specialized. A divan is a collection of poems in which the poet has composed in practically all the letters of the alphabet. That means the radif, that is the end rhyme, has to be, like alif, be, the, se, going on to very, ye. And once you've done that, of course, it's impossible to do all the letters, but you try to do as many as you can. Then you become a Sahib Diwan. So Ghalib had Diwan by the time he was 19. And this Diwan was, of course, found much later. Then he made this journey to Calcutta. That happened when he was fairly mature. He was in his 30s and he was struggling because he always felt that he had been cheated of his pension. So he decided to go to meet the Governor General. The British government center was Calcutta, so he wanted to make this journey to Calcutta and to present his case there, because he had the misinformation that he would be better heard there. Anyways, so he undertook this journey. His creditors were hounding him. And it's a long, long journey that he undertook, and more than 3,000 kilometers in those days. And he traveled on ponies. He traveled by boat. He made long stops on the way. He stopped in Banda first because he fell ill, so he spent 3 months there. Then he actually passed through Allahabad, which he didn't like. Then he spent some time in Lucknow. He spent a month in Banaras. Eventually, he reached Calcutta. And on the way to Calcutta, and that's a very important sort of landmark in his poetic career, he started composing long poems, which are known as masnavis. And one of these was about Banaras, and it's called Chirag Dar. It's considered to be one of the best masnavis in the Persian language. So we find that in dribs and drabs, Ghalib had started composing in Persian um, um, during the journey to Calcutta. And when he reached Calcutta, that's when he found that Calcutta was a very different kind of place from Delhi. A, it was a colonial city. B, it was the center of the colonial government. And C, it had printing presses. So one of the things that he noticed was that there were shops that were displaying books, and they were as brightly lit as shops that were selling jewelry. And this really, intrigued him. He also made many friends, and he met with a particular and a very close friend of his, whose name was Maulvi Sirajuddin. If you look at Ghalib's letters, and he wrote, he was very prolific. He was a big letter writer. The letters to Maulvi Sirajuddin are numerous. Anyways, he met with Maulvi Sirajuddin, who also was a kind of a printer publisher. And he published a weekly newspaper called Aina Sikandar. And he asked Ghalib to give ghazals for publishing printing in the Aina Sikandar. For Ghalib like that. Ghalib also joined the Mushaira scene in Calcutta, and he noticed that there were Mushairas in both languages. There were Mushairas in Farsi and there were Mushairas in Urdu. Now, this was something that kind of was interesting for Ghalib because mostly he had been attending Mushairas in Urdu. So here he had a variety of audience, people from Iran, people from Central Asia, who listened to his Farsi, and he had an opportunity to show off his Farsi. But there were also critics among the audience, and there were people who criticized his usage of Farsi, and that really annoyed him because Ghalib was somewhat of an egomaniac. So he didn't like criticism, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So these were some of the important things. A, attending mushairas in the two languages, and B, being interested in the power of the print, in the power of the press. And at this point also, Maulvi Sirajuddin asked Ghalib to do an intikhab for him. Now, this is the first time we hear of Ghalib attempting to do an intikhab. This is the first time, and it is in 1830s, 1830. And Maulvi Sirajuddin asked him to make a intikhab from both his Farsi and his Urdu poetry. And Ghalib said, okay, although he had hardly composed much in Farsi. So what he did was that he had a total of 455 verses in Farsi. And out of this 455, a large number of verses belong to this long Masnavi on Banaras, the Chiragh there. And of course, in Urdu, he had composed some 2,000 verses. And so he actually selected 455 verses from 2,000 verses in Urdu, and he brought in the whole of his Farsi. And he put it all together, and he called this intikhab Gulirana. And Gulirana is, apart from being a very beautiful sounding name, Gulirana means a rose that is in two colors, a two-colored rose. So Ghalib then wrote a very thoughtful introduction to this intikhab. And in this introduction, he says that, poetry is like a garden, and it has many doors. And in his garden of poetry, there are two doors, one that opens to Farsi and the other that opens to Urdu. And he hopes that the discerning readers will enjoy both his presentations. Now, when I came upon Gulirana, and I was very actually excited to read the Dibacha, because for the first time I felt that these Dibachas, which were always written in Farsi, held a clue to the way Ghalib was perceiving his own poetry. So they were kind of like a clue to understanding Ghalib's poetics, what Ghalib thought of poetry as an art, what he thought of himself as a poet, what he thought he was presenting to his listeners, to his audience. Basically, I want to use the word audience because at this time, these things were only in manuscript form. So whoever had access to the manuscript could read it. Otherwise, people would just listen to poetry. And so the Gulirana, maybe Ghalib thought that his friend would publish it, but that was not the case. The Gulirana was not published at that time. Many copies of this manuscript were made. And we actually have a copy of Gulirana in Ghalib's own handwriting, Ghalib's personal hand, which was discovered much later. But there are a total of 7 or 9 manuscripts of Gulirana that have been discovered along the way. And that's a completely different story, how Ghalib's manuscripts were discovered over a long period of time. So from here, I come to this phase of Ghalib that he had made this intikhab, right? So he had gone through his 2,000 verses in Urdu, and he had made a selection of 455, which he thought were probably his best verses, or which he wanted to share with Maulvi Sirajuddin, or whether he thought that Maulvi Sirajuddin would publish it, and so it would have a bigger audience. Anyway, he had done this. So his trip to Calcutta, as far as his pension is concerned, was not fruitful, and he was told to go back and file the papers all over again in Delhi, which was a big, disappointment for him. But as I argue in my book, the journey to Calcutta was really, really a landmark in Ghalib's life, because he was exposed to a slightly and actually more significantly important cultural milieu, which was different from Delhi. He was in a colonial city, and he was experiencing a more mixed audience to his writings than he was having in Delhi. So he was also getting into a lot of disagreements with people in the audience over his usages in Persian. And these were things that he didn't forget easily. And lastly, of course, and most important, he had made this intikhab Gulerana, so he already had a manuscript in which he had made a selection of, from his Urdu verses. So when Ghalib came back to return to Delhi, and again it was a long, painful journey back to Delhi, he decided that he was going to take to printing, and he was going to bring out a selection of his. And by 1833, he had already got a complete manuscript, complete. We know the dates because the manuscript actually from 1833 is available at the Rampur Library, and it has an introduction and all of that, which is dated. So we know that by 1833, which is very soon after his return from Calcutta, he had a selection, an intikhab ready. But it took him a long time to find a publisher. So from 18, the first publication of his Urdu Diwan or Intikhab or whatever you want to call it, we generally call it Diwan-e-Urdu, happened in 1841. So that is a very, very important landmark date, 1841, when Ghalib made his work available to a larger audience, to a large reading public, or to whoever. So I asked this question in my book, who were Ghalib's readers? Who were the people who had enough literary sensibilities, enough education to be able to read Ghalib in print? Because earlier in manuscript form, as we know, the manuscripts had a limited circulation and they were mostly meant for the elite class. Everyone else sort of got their fix of literature by going, or poetry by going to mushairas and listening to recitation, or through secondhand input by somebody reading out or someone who had taken notes at the mushaira. So the publisher who printed Ghalib was Sir Syed Ahmad Khan's older brother, and he published this book from Delhi in 1841. Now, I want to sort of take a slight detour and give you a little bit of the history of my discovery of this 1841 Diwan of Ghalib. So all along, when I had been working on my book on Ghalib, and I had been looking at the various Diwans, the most notable, of course, is 21, the Nuskha Hamidiya. They were all, manuscript Diwans. They were handwritten. Many of them were beautifully, I wouldn't say illustrated, but they were beautifully decorated. Their margins were beautiful. They had gold edgings. They were they were made on very beautiful handmade paper, and that is why they lasted so long. They're still around because the paper was so durable. The paper was not acidic. Now, I was curious what this 1841 Diwan would look like, and I was shocked when I held this Diwan in my hand because it was very, very insignificant looking, very, very ordinary compared to the beautiful manuscripts Diwan that I had handled so far. And I had been searching for it for a long time. I had gone to Rampur because I was told that the Solat Library in Rampur has a copy of the 1841 Diwan. And unfortunately, during my stay in Rampur, the Solat Library was closed for renovations, so I couldn't get my hands on the Diwan. Anyways, I came back and I was based in Delhi. I was a fellow at the CSDS and I was working at the Ghalib Institute, their collection and so on. And I was also affiliated to Jamia Millia. One day I was at the Jamia Millia Library and I was in the manuscript room and I was looking at the various, things that they had in their showcase. And the person who was the handler there, he came up to me and said, "What are you interested in?" I said, "I'm looking for Ghalib manuscripts." He showed me a few and they were all copies of earlier manuscripts. So it wasn't any great find that I had by looking at those copies. And then he said, we have something very interesting in this cupboard, and I'm going to show it to you. So I said, okay. So he brought the keys and he opened this steel almirah, and he took out a very slender little book, and he said, this is a manuscript. And I said, oh my God, this is the 1841 edition. It's a print. It's not a manuscript. And I said, this is a print. And he said, no, it's a manuscript because it was kept in the manuscript section. Anyways, I mean, you can imagine my delight at finding this manuscript divan. Actually, it's a print edition. And I was shocked by the poor quality of the paper and just how insignificant it was, but in so many ways so significant. So that's a really interesting paradox here. I was holding something that looked very insignificant, but which was very, very significant because it was the very, very first edition of Ghalib's Urdu Divan. And we know that during his lifetime itself, Khalid had 5 editions of his Urdu Divan, so 1841, 1847, and then the last one was in 1863, which is very close to his, his last years. Anyways, I want to show you some of the pictures that I have. So I'm going to share my screen, and I hope it's going to work. Can everyone see this?
No, ma'am, not yet.
No? Okay, wait. Let me go back to share screen. Can you see this?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
So this is a page that is from the 1821 Divan. And as you see, it's been decorated, and it says here, Divan Tasnif Mirza Naushad Helvi Al Mutakhallis Asad Az Kutub Khana Sarkar Faiz Ali Jah Alam Panah Mehr Faujdar Bahadur Dame Iqbalahu Khushkhat. So it tells us that it is in the library of Mehr Faujdar Muhammad Bahadur and of Bhopal. And just keep this in mind, and I'll show you now. So this is from that same divan. It is the last page, which has the colophon, and it tells us when it was completed here. And it also tells us the name of the calligrapher, Hafiz Muinuddin, Batari-e Panjam Shehr, and so on and so forth. Now, I'll show you okay. So this is the last page of a printed divan. And you can see the difference at once from the last page of the manuscript divan and the last page of the printed divan. Of course, it's been repaired and all that, but it actually used to have a mohar on the khatma. Wajh mohar ki khatme par waste sanad is baat ki ye kitab chhapi hui nizami ki dastkhat aur mohar ki gayi hai. Because this whole thing was so rare at that time, and books were so precious that it used to have, every individual copy used to have a stamp from the publisher that would verify that it was an original publication. Let me show you a few more.
Ma'am, we can't see the second image.
Oh no! All right, let's try it again. Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, so sorry, I have to go back again and tell you that this is the last page of the 1821 manuscript, which I showed you earlier, testing it. And so here it tells you in red, that this is the Diwan of Mirza Sahib Qiblahu al-Mutakhallis Ba'asad wa Ghalib Sallahum. So you know now here that he's actually talking about, um, uh, he changed his takhallus from Asad to Ghalib. So here he is telling you that he has two takhallus, Asad and Ghalib. And then here this is the name of the calligrapher Hafiz Muinuddin, and this is actually telling you the date of completion. And here it's very interesting because this is something that I also discussed in my book, which is the poet's anxiety about the reception of his work. And so this is the very last poem, the very last verses in this particular divan, and I will read it for you. It is a rubai, and it says, मुश्किल है ज़े बस कलाम मेरा ए दिल, सुन सुन के उसे सुखन वराने कामिल, आसान कहने की करते हैं फरमाइश, गोयम मुश्किल वगर न गोयम मुश्किल. So he's basically saying, मुश्किल है ज़े बस कलाम मेरा ए दिल, oh heart, my poetry is difficult. सुन सुन के उसे सुखन वराने कामिल. So the सुखन वराने कामिल, that means the wise critics. When they hear my poetry, they आसान कहने की करते हैं फरमाइश. They ask me to write simpler verses. गोयम मुश्किल वगरना गोयम मुश्किल. But if I do so, it's hard for me. If I don't do that, if I don't speak, if I don't write, it's also a very difficult thing for me. So this is part of my also part of my research about Ghalib's self-presentation, about Ghalib's anxiety towards his audience, and I can talk a little bit about this in the Q&A. But let me move on and show you another picture here. Can everyone see this?
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
Yes. Okay, so this is a picture of the last page, the same page of the colophon page of a printed divan. And here you see वास्ते सनद इस बात की कि ये किताब छपी हुई मतबा निजामी की है, दस्तखत और मुहर की गई है. So because it was, still relatively rare to have a poet publish his work, that every book had to have a seal of approval from the publisher, and this is what it is here. So if you compare the last page of the 1821 Diwan, which is a manuscript, which I just showed you, and you look at this, you see how plain and how ordinary and how plebeian this is, and you can, make a conclusion yourself about what to, make of the two, and we can talk more about this during the Q&A period. Okay, let's see what else I can show you. Can you see this? No?
Ma'am, no, not yet. It's not full screen yet. We can see.
Can you see this?
No, ma'am, it's not. Yeah.
Yeah? Can everyone see this?
Yeah.
Okay. So this is Ghalib's own handwriting. This is a page from his earliest manuscript divan. It is dated 1816. And you see here he begins, Naqsh faryadi hai kiski shokhi tahreer ka, kagazi hai pairahan har pay kare tasveer ka. All those of you who have read Ghalib or who know a little bit of Ghalib or who have heard this ghazal sung would be familiar with Naqsh faryadi hai kiski shokhi tahreer ka. So this is how the 1816 divan begins. And this is actually in Ghalib's own handwriting. Let me show you. this is the last edition, Diwan Ghalib, 1863. And this has been published by the Munshi Naval Kishore Press, and I will get to this in a minute. So let me get back to lecturing some more. How do I get back to my original page?
If you want, you can just stop sharing the screen.
Okay, should I?
Like, or if you want to continue, then you can minimize it and continue speaking and then share it.
Okay, so I hope that, you know, by looking at these visual presentations, you would have gotten some sense of the difference between manuscript culture and print culture, how ordinary print looked compared to manuscripts, and also you got a sense of Khalid's handwriting and all of that. So now, one of the questions that I struggled with was, what would have happened if Ghalib had not edited his Diwan so severely, his Urdu Diwan? Because as you know, as I've already mentioned, and probably those of you who have been following Ghalib would be aware of the fact that he had this anxiety and he was known to be a difficult poet. So if he had not made the selection, if he had gone to press with his whole Urdu Diwan, would it have become so popular? That's one question. And this question becomes much more complicated when I started looking at his Persian Diwan, because after returning from Calcutta, Ghalib practically did very little composition in Urdu. He devoted his whole attention to composing in Farsi. And the result was a huge, big Farsi Diwan. So in 1845, that is 4 years after the publication of his Urdu Diwan, he published his first Farsi Diwan, and it had 5,000 verses. So compared to the 1,400 verses in his Urdu, the Persian Diwan had 5,000 verses. And then another edition of the Farsi Diwan, which came out in 1840. No, it was in 1860. It had some 10,000 verses. So he did not do severe editing of his Farsi Diwan. Otherwise, it wouldn't have had 10,000 verses. And of course, he composed many more masnavis in Farsi, many long poems. So the question was, why edit the Urdu and why not edit the Farsi? And then if this could be related in some way to his popularity in Urdu and his not so importance in Farsi. And this is a very tricky question, because while his Urdu poetry is very complex and it is filled with metaphors, his Farsi poetry is also complex, but it is not quite as complicated and complex as his Urdu poetry. Because in Farsi, he was following more of the mainline aesthetics of poetry. He was following the great masters. And if any one of you has read Farsi, has read Hafiz or Shaukat or whatever, you will see that the cultural backdrop of the Farsi ghazal is very different from the cultural backdrop of the Farsi ghazal of the poets who were writing in this new style, which Ghalib was. So although he claimed to be following the classical tradition, and he was, in the sense that he was composing ghazals and masnavis and qasas and all of those things, he was in some ways not being as wildly experimental in his Persian as he was in his Urdu. And for the reason which I consider, it was my conclusion, that because Farsi had this deep classical tradition, it had a long classical history of poetry, Ghalib wanted to conform to that tradition in Farsi, whereas Urdu, which had a shorter history, maybe 200 years at the most, Ghalib felt more unbound and free to experiment. And he was also kind of balancing himself between Farsi and Urdu, especially in the early part of his career. So, and I repeat myself, he started by composing in Urdu. And he moved on to Persian. He kept composing in Farsi for 20 years. And then he comes back to Urdu very late in his life, in 1850, when he's appointed to the court. And so when you look at his selections, many people say that he rejected most of his early verses. And but that's not correct, because it was impossible for him to reject most of his early verses because he was most prolific in Urdu during that time. So he already had those 2,000 verses. And even if he deselected half of them, he still took about 900 verses from the early period. So ultimately, out of the 1,800 or so verses that comprise his Urdu Diwan, 50% of them are from the early period and 50% are from the later period. Now, I just want to make another important comment here, which is that in his mature poetry, and after he had dabbled in Farsi for 20 years, when Ghalib returns to Urdu, I wouldn't say he's simpler, he's as complex, but his language is more straightforward. He's using less Farsi to support his ideas. He's more direct. There's more Ravani in his poetry. It's more lucid. It's less ambiguous. It's less opaque. And so that's the important change that we see in the later poetry. And that's why in the later half of his career, he didn't deselect whatever he composed. He kind of selected most of his later compositions in his divan. So this is an important conclusion that I reached during the course of my research. Now to go back again to why poets compose, what is the reason for writing poetry, other than the fact that it gives you it satisfies your intellectual craving and you have this desire to string words together, and you have a native, an intrinsic capability of putting words together into to express abstract ideas. The ghazal itself is a very, very compressed form of poetry. Because it consists of 2-line verses, and in 2 lines you have to complete the thought. And so you have very few words with which to say what you have to say. And to be an expert in the ghazal needs a lot of practice, and it needs a lot of imaginative genius, which Ghalib had. And so we find that Ghalib's mind was very, very creative. And he was actually searching for language to express his ideas. So he was struggling actually with language in the early part of his career. And he kept falling back on Persian and on Persian constructions, primarily because he just didn't have that polish or that expertise at that point in his career. And when he goes back to Urdu later on, he has acquired that expertise. So I'll just give you an example from one of his early verses, which kind of gives us a window into the way he was thinking. And he says, "हुजूम फिक्र से दिल मिस्ल मौज लर्जे है, हुजूम फिक्र से दिल मिस्ल मौज लर्जे है, कि शीशा नाजुक को सहबाए आब गुदाज you see that there are so many difficult words here, and I'll explain them to you. Hujum means a crowd or a crush. Hujum, but it's a hujum fikr, so it's a crush of thought. It's a huge crowding of thought. Hujum fikr se dil misle mauj larze hai. So because of the pressure of thought, his heart is undulating like a wave. It's kind of excited. Shisha nazuk sebaya abgina gudaz. Shisha means the wine glass. So the wine glass, that is the language. The wine glass is nazuk. Because how to express those thoughts, you need language. But the shisha is nazuk, and the sehba, which means wine, sehbaya abgina gudaz, and the wine that is in the jug is bubbling. It is hot. It is gudaz. So the fikr, his ideas are, his mind is bubbling with ideas, but the language, the receptacle in which he has to pour these ideas is very nazuk and very brittle. So and again, this very famous share, garmiye nishat tasawwur se nagma sanj, garmiye nishat tasawwur se nagma sanj, मैं अंदली वे गुलशन ना आफरीदा हूँ. Once again, this verse is littered with Persian construction and phrases. But what stands out to me is the garmiye nishat tasawwur. Nishat means joy, tasawwur means heart, imagination. So I'm singing Nagma Sanj, I am singing, I'm breaking into song. I'm singing from the joy of imagination. I am the bulbul, andalib mane bulbul. I am the bulbul of a gulshan, of a garden that is still to be created. Na Afrida, that has yet to be created. So I'm so much ahead of my times. I am so full of ideas. My creativity is so boundless. And there's a lot of verses from his early poetry which are in this mode. So you feel that he was running after a very high level of ideas, but he was using a very difficult and complicated linguistic structure to express those ideas. And if he had shared all these, the two verses that I've just quoted for you from his rejected verses, from his Mustarad Kalam, so he didn't include them in his intikhab. If he had, published the whole thing and not done a selection, probably it would have been too heavy for the audience, for his readers to be able to enjoy. So the fact that he did this heavy duty editing, in which he left out, of course, because he did the editing himself, he left out many beautiful verses. His popularity maybe wouldn't have been as much. And of course, the fact that he chose to publish at a time when I think he was probably the very first Urdu poet to publish his poetry, to go to print, to embrace print in such a big way as he did. I think part of his popularity also rests on this extremely smart decision that he made to publish his poetry. So I think I want to stop here because I feel I have shared with you a lot of things, and I kind of look forward more to a discussion after this talk. So I want to stop here and open the floor discussing.
Ma'am, thank you very much for your brilliant lecture about the print history of Ghalib's Diwan and Ghalib as an evolving poet. Now there is one question that in the chat box, or is it from Facebook or chat box? I think it's from Facebook. Name of the question speaker is this Bindu A. Mama. The question is, who was the muse for his romantic poetry?
That's such a cute question. who was the muse for his romantic poetry? Well, there is this, he was fond of, like most people were, going to visit the singers and dancers who were performing ghazals. And uh, the film Mirza Ghalib also shows his affair with one of the courtesans. I doubt if he had a particular muse for his poetry. I feel that he had a sort of imaginary muse, which was used in the classical tradition. Um, of course, the muse was always a beautiful woman who had long flowing black hair and sort of a wild look about her. And he has actually described his muse in his prefaces to his divan. And so I feel that the muse was again an imaginary muse, not a real flesh and blood person. I hope this doesn't disappoint you because Ghalib did write some of the most touching romantic poetry, though not a whole lot of it, but yes, he did.
Thank
Okay, I
you.
think there are some questions in the chat box. Should I go there?
Okay, ma'am. Sure.
Okay. Okay, so this question is about Ghalib Dastamboy, 1858 print history or publication. In the recent edition, the editor says that Dastamboy remains to be a statement of Ghalib's loyalty to the British authorities since it has a big qasida and praise of Queen Victoria. But why was the Dastamboy published from Agra and not Delhi? Madam, do you believe Dastamboy's argument that Delhi was a specious prison where only, okay. Yeah, I mean, this is a good question about the Dastamboy or the so-called diary of Ghalib, which sort of documents his experiences in the 1857 revolt. So Ghalib, so the diary was actually, because it was meant for public consumption, right? It was presented to Queen Victoria. And so it wasn't Ghalib's real feelings about the British. Um, it was more of kind of a perfunctory description of how he lived, the challenges that he personally faced during 1857. And his primary goal was to receive recognition of and support from the colonial rulers in some form or the other because he was struggling, he was old. But in reality, if you were to read his letters, his personal letters during this period, which was sent to the Nawab of Rampur, they tell us quite a different story. Also, if you carefully read the Dastamboy, with in between the lines, the desperation. At one spot he says that we are eating, hum apne kapde kha rahe hain, or also his brother was shot and killed during this time. It's a very loaded document, and it's not so easy to just dismiss it as a pro-British account. You have to read between the lines. You know that all of Ghalib's friends were executed and killed in the reprisal after 1857. So he couldn't have been happy or in love with the British government at all. As to why it was published from Agra, it's because many of Ghalib's shagids were from Agra, and particularly Shishi Narayan, who undertook this. So it went through various um, I want to say different people whom he wanted to trust with the publication because he wanted it to be very spectacular. And ultimately he settled on Agra, not because there wasn't, and of course you're right. I mean, Delhi was devastated after 1857 and probably there weren't many printing presses available. So Agra was a good choice, but also because Agra was an important center for print, as was Lucknow. I hope that answers your question. Okay, here we have another question by Janika Paul. what were your learnings from analyzing his readers, and to what degree did the audience that he thought he had affected his writings, and how? Questions. I feel that his readers were people who were of the modern mindset, were buying into this idea of owning a book, because there's this other huge question of authorship, and to what extent does the author own his own work, his or her own work? Once it is released to the public, it becomes public property. And of course, you have copyright. But so with the print and publication taking off in this big way, book owning became also something like a precious commodity. And so many of Ghalib's readers may not actually have been readers per se, but may have just been owners of this book. And many of his readers might have been people who, let's say one person had a book and there would be like a group of people who would sit around that person and that person would read out from the book. Because as you know, Ghalib's poetry, at least a good chunk of it, you need to sit down with the dictionary. And that is why Ghalib is perhaps the only poet in Urdu literary history who has had like a series of commentators working on his poetry. So we have more than 100 commentaries on his poetry, and most people like to read Ghalib along with a commentary, along with somebody who is helping them understand the intricacies of the poetry. So I don't think he was, I feel that there is not enough data on education literacy, on literacy levels, to know what were the literacy levels at this time and then how many people were actually reading the book as reading. So that's a good question. But as to your second question, to what degree did the audience affect his writing and how? I think that's another very good question, and I have actually thought about it, because what I did was I started to look at the order, at the arrangement of his divans. And I found that even though the divans are organized alphabetically, there is a lot of freedom in between those sections. Like if the radif is alif, if it is ending with alif, you have a lot of room to organize within alif, within bay, like that. So I noticed that the placement of ghazals was such that after two very difficult ones would be a relatively easier one, and so on and so forth. And if you look at the end of his, when you get to the last few ghazals, you always find that there are some ghazals that are more appealing, and they have been kept for that purpose over there. Let me kind of grab a divan here and see if I can find you. Just give me a second. Sorry, it's taking me a little long. You find that, towards the end, you have ghazals like Rone se aur ishq mein bebak ho gaye, dhoye gaye hum itne ke bas tak ho gaye. And let's see this one. कभी नेकी भी उसके जी में अगर आ जाए है मुझसे, जफाएं करके अपनी याद शर्मा जाए है मुझसे. So within ye, he will, place ghazals that have more appeal. चाहिए अच्छों को जितना चाहिए ये अगर चाहें तो फिर क्या चाहिए, things like that. So there is a certain way of placating the audiences that I discerned in Ghalib, and I was able to put my finger on that only by looking at the various recensions of his divans, as he moves from one divan to the other. What is he maintaining the same order? Is he changing the order? What are the last ghazals that are appearing? And I always found that towards the end, he was always giving you the softer ghazals. Um, so I think, that was something that I covered. And thank you for this question. Does Ghalib do any other work except poetry? Yes, he has a huge slew of writing other than poetry. The most important, of course, are his letters. So he was a big letter writer, and in the beginning of his career, he was writing only in Persian. So all the prose was in Persian, and all his early letters are in Persian, and they comprise two big volumes. But later in his life, he was writing letters only in Urdu, and there are 5 volumes of his Urdu letters, which are really, really beautiful because they are some of the best examples of Urdu letter writing and a prose style, because Urdu was a young language and Urdu didn't have a lot of prose. Ghalib's prose is actually exemplary. He's a prose stylist, both for Farsi and for Urdu. So yes, he did a lot of other writing. He also wrote a short history for. So initially, he was appointed at the court to write a history of the Mughal emperors, and he was no historian, so he didn't want to do that, and he kicked up a little bit of a fuss. So he was given the help of the official historian who collected data for him. And it was supposed to be a 2-volume history, but actually he ended up writing only 1 volume. So he did write other stuff, and of course he wrote a lot of essays. So he did a lot of writing other than poetry. What extent Ghalib is still a readable poet in our era? That's a very good question. And I think that Ghalib, because he's a poet who talks about existential angst, and that's a word that is very popular in our times. Existential angst is something that everyone is talking about, particularly during the pandemic. Ghalib's poetry is filled with that, mostly because he was living in those difficult times of transition, the ending of one era, post 1857, and even before that, leading up to 1857. Um, Also because ghazal as a genre is tackles all these questions about existence. The ghazal is essentially a poem that is both philosophical and mystical. So it began, ghazal poetry actually began as a mystical poem, but then it developed, it sort of grew, its range widened, and it can be about anything now, right? You can write a ghazal about the environment, you can write a ghazal about the pandemic, you can write a ghazal about anything. But essentially, at its core, it is about existence. It is about the question of creation. Who are we? What is our relationship with God? What is love? What is our relationship? Did love is the force of creation. Love is the force of imagination. So these are huge questions, and that is why the ghazal has prospered in our times. It hasn't actually fizzled away. I find more and more people taking to the ghazal, writing ghazals, in recently I come across ghazals in English, which have become very popular, ghazals in Hindi. And, I mean, the scope is endless. So particularly in our times, I feel that and particularly for Ghalib, because he's not the average poet. He is one of our greatest poets. And as a great poet, his mind works in ways that an ordinary mind, your and my mind, will not work in that way. I mean, we can think about those things, but we don't have that kind of word power to express it so succinctly as he does. So he's very relevant to us in our times, and we want to read him. We want to, and also as South Asians, poetry is very important for us in our lives. It is almost synchronic to our existence. And poetry is something that gives us meaning and purpose to life. It's a thing of beauty. And all of us hunger after beauty. We have an insatiable hunger for beauty, and that poetry is something that satisfies that hunger. So I would say that Ghalib is certainly very relevant to our times. Any more questions, comments?
I just want to thank you for this fine presentation and the fact that Ghalib is actually such an important figure. And we are organizing this lecture in the history department. Why is it that historians have not been as interested in Ghalib's work and career as they should have been in view of the fact that he is such an important figure pre-1857 and post? So what is the difficulty with the historians in terms of, is it linguistic inability on the part of the historian? Persian and Urdu of very high philosophical, metaphysical kind. So the linguistic disability on the part of the historian working on the 19th century could be one reason perhaps. But increasingly we know that literary scholars and historians are coming together for a more fruitful kind of historical research, which is based on literary material. And so much progress in the last 20-30 years has happened. Literary scholars writing history, historians recognizing literary scholars, and vice versa. And still, with a few exceptions, perhaps historians are still not working on a figure like Ghalib. Even in the wake of the discussion on 1857, 150 years, death celebration, we find that Ghalib was somewhat absent in that discussion, huge discussion. And the fact is, Ghalib really suffered, as we know through the Sambu also. So what, in your opinion, is the difficulty with the historians, that they are actually not particularly, is it merely that Ghalib is for romantic poetry of the ghazal kind, and historians are not not romantic enough, that they think they look for hard facts in government files, and government files are all fudged? So perhaps reading Ghalib could have been a better strategy on the part of the historians, isn't it? And we have one or two very good literary scholars here. Professor Mazhar Mehdi, who's our Urdu colleague in JNU, he's also around. Maybe he can also pitch in with his opinion on this.
Yeah, I think that one of the difficulties in accessing the prose of the period in which Ghalib was writing is the difficulty of Indo-Persian, because you need a certain kind of training to read Indo-Persian, and particularly the Indo-Persian which is in the literary register. So it's not like, because I started by reading texts, Persian texts in history, like Barni and, Bazayuni and all that, and that's very easy. Farishta, it's very straightforward. If you read Khusro, for example, even Khusro hasn't been tapped enough as a history figure. His Ghurratul Kamal, very few people read that because it's a high register of literary Farsi. So similarly with Ghalib's register is a very high Indo-Persian register, and you need special training to read it. I had to spend years training with my father before I could actually understand his dibachas. And I'm the first person to have translated the dibachas. No one else has, because they were just dismissed as flights of imagination. People said that, there's nothing, it's all fluff, but actually it's not. It's very difficult to unravel the whole thing. And once you do, it tells you a lot about the linguistic politics of Northern India, of how Urdu is still a regional language and Farsi is a language that goes beyond the borders. That's why he went, if you compare Ghalib and Iqbal again, you have the example is there. Why did Iqbal turn to Farsi after starting with because he wanted to expand his reach. So similarly, Ghalib did the same thing. And as far as Dastamboy is concerned, thank you for this question, because what he did in Dastamboy was he was trying to show his control over Farsi by not using a single word from Arabic. And so he was going back to very early Farsi. Those of you who are historians know that the Farsi as a literary language was very highly developed before the Arabs conquered Persia, and they introduced a lot of Arabic. So everywhere they went, Arabic became the important language, except in Persia, which resisted the imposition of Arabic. And there was a movement going on in Akbar's time to revive the old Farsi, right, the pure Farsi. And that was called the Satir movement. Also, not enough work has been done recently. There has been some work on the Satir and its implications. But that too is an important thing. So Ghalib was interested in Dasatir. He was interested in pre-Arabic Persian. And so Dastamboy he was very meticulous not to use a single Arabic word. If it crept in, he would scratch it out. So it was more, so it needs to be looked at from various perspectives. A, as you said, as a document of 1857, B, as a document of linguistic hubris, C, as a document of a poet who had become the court, Bahadur Shah's court poet, and who was now seeking Queen Victoria's patronage. So there's so many things going on with Dastamboy, and not enough has been done with it.
If I can just add to this, you responded earlier that Ghalib actually was serving as a historian at Bahadur Shah's the first court, and he has mentioned about this in Dastamboy also, and mentioning how he was actually not very particularly keen, yes, etc. So whatever little he wrote, he gave, and etc. But you were mentioning that one of the 2 volumes were actually completed, and so is it available in manuscript form, and whether historians are using it?
No, they're not using it. They are not using it. It's called Mehr Rose, the midday sun. And then the second one was to be Mehr Ma, but he never did the second volume. So it is there. People need to work on it. And as a historian yourself, that the practice was that when you started writing another book, you always had the work that had been done before, right? And you took excerpts from that. That was a common practice. You took chunks from what earlier writers had done, and then you patched it on to your book, and then you added some more stuff, your own perspective. So it was a patchwork. And if Ghalib was doing this patchwork, I mean, okay, granted, he was a better poet than a historian, but he certainly did that. Also, there has been an interest in Tazkira, because Tazkira is also a historical document, right? It tells you the histories of poets in a certain era, and it also adds on and on. So it's a cumulative document. Tazkiras are like that. They take material from earlier Tazkiras and then they add more. So that is also a very interesting thing, and more historians and literature experts should come together to unravel this 19th century period, which is very, very interesting, I would say. I feel that Ghalib's qasidas also need more work. Mostly we have been focusing on his ghazals, and now recently some people have started working on the masnavis, but also the qasidas, the form of, the praises that he is heaping on his patrons, on the ruler, the whole politics of qasida writing. All of this can be studied from the historical point of view. And so there is so much to be done on Ghalib and on other poets, on his peers. For example, Momin is a very important poet, and very few people have worked on Momin. People were multifaceted, they did many things. So, of course, there's a whole lot of work to be done.
Sorry, ma'am, sorry to interrupt you, ma'am. There are 2 more questions in the chat box.
Why do people view Mirza Ghalib as a romantic poet? Yeah, I think there is a whole mindset which views ghazal poetry as romantic poetry. So they are unwilling to move away from this preconceived notion that the ghazal is a romantic poem, which it is. It is a romantic poem, but it doesn't mean that all ghazals are romantic poems. As I said, the ghazal is more about existential crisis. It is more about who we are. You know, it's more inward looking. It's more about what constitutes our emotions and how we connect with them. So you can think of that as romantic, but you know, actually in ghazal poetry, the beloved and the lover are imaginary. They are not real people. They are always people who are extremes, who are, you know, their emotions are in the extreme. And that is because the ghazal wants to portray the extremes that love can go to. And eventually it's kind of can be used towards mystical or spiritual union with God, because union with the beloved can easily glide into union with God. So there are so many levels to ghazal poetry. There are so many layers to ghazal. And I feel that a lot more work can be done. We are only scratching the surface right now. And I am, you know, many people have said to me, why didn't you write this book in Urdu? Why did you write it in English? And the easiest answer is because I wanted to educate my English readers. I wanted to bring Ghalib into world literature so that more people can join the discourse. I can have more people asking questions and thinking about these issues, which wouldn't have been possible if I was doing it in Urdu. So, of course, we need to expand the field. We need to expand it as far as we can go. I think that's the question.
Sorry, there is one more question by Krishna. It's about ma'am. May you please talk about Ashobe Shahar in Ghalib's works?
Share
Share,
Ashu.
share Ashok.
Shahar Ashobe, yes,
Hmm.
right. Ma'am.
I I don't think Ghalib wrote Share Ashu. He was primarily writing more about, as I said, you know, he was more of a intellectual, cerebral kind of mind who was grappling more with abstract ideas than with social history. Um, though his contemporaries, like his seniors like Sauda and all, did write a lot of Shahra Shobs. But you know, everybody has their own um, area of specialization, and Khalid particularly, you know, abstraction, looking at modern. So his mind was very modern. He was always putting question marks in front of his perspectives were like that. I think that's about it.
If you would like, there are there are two more questions. If you would you
What?
please, uh, it is by
Why did ghazals become so popular among poets and audience? Okay, that's a good question. A lovely question, and thank you, Nikita. So the ghazal is a very, very musical poem. You know, it has meter, it has rhyme, it has end rhyme, and moreover, the idea is complete in two lines. So it's meant to be sung, and many singers have done a lot of beautiful justice to poetry by singing it and making it even more um, accessible. I have written about this whole transition of singing ghazals, you know, I mean, the importance of ghazals being sung, because when they're sung, they begin to adopt also the triggers of music. So the triggers, music has a lot of emotional triggers. You know, when you listen to a sad song, you become sad. When you listen to a happy song, you become happy. So the music itself, even if you don't understand the words, nobody is going to take a sad ghazal and set it to cheerful music. So the music and the poetry go together. And that is why the musicality of the ghazal has made it so popular. The Geet, for example, is a spin-off from there, right? You have film songs which also follow the same Radif Qafiya pattern, and that is because of the musicality of the genre. So I think that's a good question. What's Ghalib's space on spiritual poetry? Yeah, I mean, suddenly Ghalib, for example, a ghazal like Dil Nadan Tujhe Hua Kya Hai, Aakhir Is Dard Ki Dawa Kya Hai. He begins on a romantic mode, and then he goes on a very philosophical mode, very like 3-4 shares down the line. He says, Sabzao gul kahan se aaye hain, abr kya cheez hai, hawa kya hai. So when I teach this ghazal, I tell my students that in these few words, he has asked the most, the biggest questions about existence. Sabzao gul kahan se aaye, from where have the flowers and the greenery come from? Abr kya cheez hai, hawa kya hai. What are the clouds? What is air? Ye pari chehra log kaise hain? Ramzao ishwao ada kya hai? Who are these beautiful people? What are all these नाज और नखराज? What does all this mean? हमको उनसे वफा की है उम्मीद जो नहीं जानते वफा क्या है. That loyalty from people don't even know what loyalty is. So you see, this is the beauty of the ghazal, that it glides from one huge question into another question almost seamlessly. And the way it does it is because of the structure of the ghazal, because it is strung together through meter, through rhyme, through end rhyme, that you see the transition happening and you accept it, even though it is a huge transition. Right? हमें मुश्ताक और वो बेजार या इलाही ये माजरा क्या है? And from there, सब्ज़ो गुल कहाँ से आए हैं, अब्र क्या चीज़ है, हवा क्या है? A very big question. So this is what happens in ghazal, and that is why it is so appealing to us, because of the huge range of philosophical, spiritual, romantic, you name it, the topics that it can touch upon, and how it can actually penetrate our consciousness because of the precision of the few words that the poet uses. Words are so few and they quickly strike the target, which is the human heart and the mind. So that's why it is so popular and so appealing.
Thank you very much, ma'am. It was really a refreshing talk. Before we close this session, I have one announcement to make, that next week there will be another lecture, and the speaker will be Professor Anirudh Deshpande. The topic of that talk will be Their Words and Our Meanings, Anachronism and Maratha History. So I think here I would like to close the session here. Sir, would you please make some closing remarks, Razi sir?
Just a quick thank you note for agreeing to speak to us, and it was great to listen to you. So much to think on the part of what is lacking in terms of historical research of the 19th century, where such important figure as Ghalib was the last Mughal poet and historian has not been such an important figure in historical research, but your work is forcing us to think that it is important that we discuss Ghalib also, including his romantic ghazal, powerful mystical poetry actually. So
Sure.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Yeah, let me plug my book if you
Yeah.
haven't already.
Yes, yeah, it needed to be launched. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank you.
much. Thank you so much. It was great connecting with people across I don't know how many thousand miles. And
Yeah.
so much for the lovely session. I hope to be here again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.